Hello everyone, this is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to this tutorial that is all about satin stitching. This tutorial is going to be the first of two satin stitching tutorials. This is part one, and this tutorial will cover basics about all types of satin stitching, but specifically satin stitching that is parallel. In other words, the stitches are all parallel to each other. There is a type of satin stitching that has the stitches where they go in an arc, like around a flower petal. Let me see, I may have an example of it here. Like, do you see these flower petals, how the stitches go like this towards the center? That is not the kind of satin stitching we're going to be talking about. We are going to be talking about this kind where every stitch is parallel to each other all in a row. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, satin stitching is one of those things that tends to be a love it or hate it kind of a thing. Everybody loves the look of it, the satiny sheen, how smooth and shiny it is, and how pretty it fills up a space on your embroidery, but sometimes achieving it is not so straightforward and it frustrates people. And you know how there are some stitches that you can just look at a diagram, pick up a needle and thread, and after a couple of tries you can just get that stitch. Satin stitching is deceptive in that it looks simple, but there are several things that you need to know before you jump in so that you can be happy with it. So let's get right to what those things are. Some of the basic information is, first and foremost, the kind of fabric you're going to be stitching on, and this is important. You need accuracy when you are satin stitching because you need to be able to know exactly, or to be able to bring your needle up and put it down into the fabric in very accurate places so that you get nice edges and, the good placement of your stitches. If you're using a fabric that is very soft or has a very open, loose weave, it's hard to get that accuracy because you're, like for instance, cross stitch fabric, you know how it has big holes and it's in a grid? You are sort of forced to go up or go down in those holes, which makes it harder to choose just the right place. If you need stitches that are very, very close together and your holes are this far apart, you can't get that accuracy. So what I recommend most often is a good quality quilting cotton, especially if you're just starting out. Cotton is great and a nice quality. Don't skimp and get the cheapy stuff because it's just frustrating to work on, honestly. This one is from Free Spirit. It's designer solid, so beautiful colors, nice tight weave, and it's heavy enough that it can hold up to all that stitching. That's what this pink one is as well. I believe this is a Kona fabric. Again, beautiful color. Get really close so you can see how close that weave is. You can satin stitch on other types of fabric, of course. Linen is another favorite of people. You have to watch out for linen though, because sometimes linens can be, they vary widely. Some of them can be great and some of them are very soft and open, have an open weave. This is a linen blend that I have stitched on and I really like. In fact, this hoop right here is stitched on this fabric. Like I said, it's a blend, but it is a tight enough weave that you can get good accuracy and it doesn't, the holes on the fabric don't open up as you're stitching. So this one is good. Sometimes with linen you just have to look at it and feel it to see if it's good. This under here, this is actually linen as well. It is 100% linen and it's much softer. This has been ironed so it's flat, very smooth, but it's a much softer fabric. And so the weave is a little bit larger, the holes between the threads in this are a little bit bigger, but it can be done. This one was stitched on satin stitch, a lot of satin stitching you can tell on that same fabric. I had to adjust my stitching a little bit though to compensate for the softness of the fabric, and I had to not pull my stitches as hard so as not to open up the holes in that fabric. So that is a discussion about fabric. While we're talking about fabric, while you are stitching, you are going to want to keep the fabric as tight as it can possibly be the whole time you are stitching. Loose fabric for any kind of stitching makes it harder to be accurate. But in satin stitching, it's really difficult to get accurate, smooth satin stitching on fabric that is very loose in the hoop. So a way to keep that fabric tight is to wrap the inner hoop with cotton twill tape. And I have a whole video talking just about this, but that's what it looks like. I've just wrapped it, and so that way when you stretch your fabric in this hoop and tighten the screw, that cotton twill tape allows the inner and outer hoops to squeeze the fabric really hard, and it keeps the fabric tight the whole time you're stitching. So you're not constantly fighting fabric that has loosened up as you're working on it, or if you push on it a little bit, it stays drum tight, and that's really, really critical. That will also reduce the puckering, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, as you're satin stitching. You don't want puckers, and loose fabric can cause puckers. Now that we've talked about fabric and hoops, let's talk about thread. One of the most common threads you can use for satin stitching is this 6-stranded cotton thread. This is DMC. But it makes a difference how you separate your strands. You can definitely satin stitch with 6 strands, but it's more common to stitch with fewer strands, really, and this goes for any type of stitching, satin stitching or not. But how you separate those strands is really critical when it comes to satin stitching. It sounds like it would be a minor thing about how you pull the strands apart, and like it wouldn't really affect how it looks, how your stitching looks, but trust me, it really, really does. I have another video that is all about how to separate the strands of your thread, so please check that out. I'll put a link in the comments below. But the short version is, see how there are strands right here? Get so you can see that up really close. You are going to want to separate those out here at the top. Take one strand and pull it out, and pull that whole thing out, and then you have one strand, and so however many strands you need, you're going to pull one at a time, recombine them, and then that way you've got your thread ready for satin stitching. That makes all the difference in the world to how your satin stitching will look, because the strands will lay parallel to each other instead of being twisted in a rope. Really critically important, don't skip that step. As you're stitching, it is very helpful often to draw guidelines. And whether you're doing the parallel kind of satin stitching or the kind that goes in an arc, guidelines are very helpful. You can draw them ahead of time. Like this pattern of mine, if you get the kit, the pre-printed fabric will already have the guidelines printed on there. But this is parallel satin stitching, and all these guidelines are already drawn on here, parallel, and that will help to keep you stitching at the right angle. Whether it's you're doing angle stitching or parallel, either way, the guidelines are a nice visual guide so that you know more easily where to place each of your stitches. The last thing I want to say about this type of satin stitching, the parallel type, is that you really want your stitches to sit next to each other. You do not want them to cross over. All right, they just want to be snuggled up right next to each other all the way across, so that each of those strands lays smooth. And that is what is going to give you that very beautiful and pretty and silky sheen of those stitches sitting right next to each other all in a row. There are 3 different ways to approach outlining for your satin stitching. You can have an outline that sits outside of your stitching. You can have an outline that you stitch on the inside of your design, and then your satin stitching goes over the top, covers that outline. Or you can have satin stitching that has no line at all. You just start running your stitches back and forth inside of a shape that has no outline. One of the advantages of the outline that sits on the outside, it's decorative. It can be the same color of your satin stitching or a different color for contrast. One of the big advantages of it is that it can hide the edges of your satin stitching. So if the edges where your needle goes in and out are a little bit jagged, and that's a little bit one of your problem areas, outline stitching can definitely hide that. It does take time, so if you're in a hurry, maybe that's not the most ideal situation. The stitches that you can use for an outline stitch are any stitch that would be good for lines. Back stitch, chain stitch. This here is a split back stitch. I use 3 strands. So it looks like a little eensy weensy teeny tiny chain stitch. I like it because it's a little smoother, more of a solid line than back stitch. And it does look like a little bitty chain stitch, but it's a nice tight line, so it's good for outlining. On this one, I have already stitched the outline that I'm going to stitch over, and if you look back here, this one is stitched exactly on your pattern line. The outline that goes on the inside is stitched just inside that pattern line. Can you see that right there? See how that you can still see the black edge, the black outline of the pattern line? That's because if you were to put this type of outline on the pattern line and then stitch over it, your shape is going to be bigger than the intended shape is supposed to be, because you're going to come outside that line. So good stitches for this, it doesn't really matter, they're going to be covered up, but back stitch is very common. You can do the split back stitch. This is a simple back stitch. So again, 3 strands right inside the line. And the advantages of this one are it gives you a kind of a raised edge, kind of a rolled edge on the edge of your shape, which looks really nice. And it also is a little bit helpful when you are determining where to put your needle down into the thread. You're not just picking a place on like just here or here or here. You've got this edge that it sort of serves as a guide as you're stitching. Now that we are ready to actually do some stitching, before we start, let's decide what angle we want our stitches to be. And once we decide that, then if you want to, you can draw in some guidelines. So as far as angles go, you want to keep in mind a couple of things. One of them is the size of your shape. You do not want your satin stitches to be really, really long, because the longer they are, the more they can get loose. So if you have a shape, maybe on this one, this is not that big of a shape, but I would consider, sometimes the pattern itself determines what angle the stitches will be. Like if it's a flower or whatever, and you want all the stitches to go towards the center of the flower, it just depends. If you're designing your own pattern, then you can decide where they go, right? So let's say, but for this one, I might not go from here across to here, so have all my stitches running this way, because this is a pretty long stitch. That ends up being probably 1.25 inches, which would probably work. Not too bad. But if I was going to choose, I might decide to go either straight up and down with these stitches. I could go at an angle. Just decide what you want for the look of it and for the practicality of how long your stitches will be. So I think I'm going to do what I said and kind of work at an angle. So I'm going to lay in some guidelines. This is my Frixion erasable gel pen, but it doesn't really matter because these are going to be covered up. You could use an air-soluble marker or water-soluble marker, a pencil. Doesn't really matter, whatever you're comfortable with. But I'm just going to quickly lay in these lines. They don't have to be close together. Since what we're talking about here is parallel stitching, I'm going to work to keep those guidelines parallel. Again, they're going to be covered up, so it doesn't matter how neat they are. And since we are filling in this shape on the inside, obviously I'm going to come up. Oh, let me back up a little bit and talk about where to start. Some people like to start in the center of a shape and work across to the side and then come back to the center, tie off here, come back to the center and work back to this side. That is perfectly fine and that's great. For some reason, not quite sure why, I tend to work left to right. I am pretty picky about where I place each stitch, and so sometimes I feel like if I already have a stitch there, that I've already limited myself as far as where my stitches can go. Same thing goes, some people don't want to draw a guideline, which is fine, but they will make a stitch. They'll make a stitch here or a stitch here, and use some initial stitches as a guideline. They'll put one stitch and one stitch and one stitch and then go back and fill in between the stitches. Again, that is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. I have no problem with that. Personally, again, I don't like to have a stitch sitting there that as I'm working across, it might not be where I would have placed that stitch if I was just working from left to right. But, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. So if that works for you, you do that. All right. So now we are ready to start. Because we are filling in this shape, I'm going to come up inside the outline. I'm going to be very careful with this type of stitching not to split the outline stitching. So when I come up with my needle, I'm going to make sure that I am not, can you see that? I'm not coming up inside the stitching. I'm coming up underneath the stitching. And when I go down, I'm also going to be careful to make sure that I can even angle my needle a little bit instead of going in maybe straight. Can you see that? So my needle would not be going, I'm trying to see whether you can see it, not at this angle, but more at this angle so that I'm going under a little bit that outline stitching. And here's the part about satin stitch that I think maybe frustrates people the most, and that is, how to get that stitch right next to the stitch next to it. And so it is a little bit slower because you can't just sort of haphazardly bring your needle up without giving it a little bit of thought and having a little bit of patience with it. Good lighting makes a huge difference. If you can't see, where exactly, sometimes I'll spend just a little bit of time. Let me zoom in. Sometimes I will spend, just a few seconds hunting around for the right place. And sometimes, if you really want to be accurate, even just one little fiber of your fabric can make a difference, coming up here instead of here. So just be a little bit patient, especially as you are just starting out. And when I come up, I'm trying maybe sometimes to come up a little bit at an angle instead of coming straight up into the fabric, which I might tend to split that outline. I will try just a little bit to not split that stitch. Again, this is where good lighting helps. And go down. And if you get a little bit off from your angle, it is not the end of the world. One stitch is just not going to ruin the whole thing. Just maybe correct on the other one, but if you do feel like if you've got a stitch that's just like way off like that, you've got a big space right there, go ahead, take that one out and put it back down. Maybe you can see right here, because I stripped my threads the way I talked about earlier, see how when that stitch lays down, how those strands are very smooth. I'm already seeing a nice smooth satin, smooth finish on it. It's because those threads, those strands, are laying side by side instead of being twisted into a rope. So that's why stripping threads are really important. So as I get going here a little bit, and I'll also tell you that, as much satin stitching as I've done, it takes me just sometimes, if it's been a while since I've done it, it takes me a little while to find that rhythm, that coordination between hand and eye and brain, and just find that rhythm. Sometimes I get it right off the bat, and sometimes I don't. Okay, so to me, that stitch right there is a little bit, it's not quite close enough to the outline, so there's going to be sort of a white space there. I could probably leave it and it would be fine, but you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and back that one out. I'm going to pull it from the back side too, because the problem was where I went into the fabric. So let me rethread my needle. Give me 1 second here. This is maybe another reason that satin stitching takes a little more patience. Okay, now I'm rethreaded. I'm going to start over, find a better spot that's closer to that outline. Another trick that you can use to determine where to put your needle back down is you can take this thread and you can lay it. You can lay it down. You know, you don't have to do this for every single stitch, but if you're finding yourself struggling, you can lay it down and say, okay, I know I don't want it to be there because that's not right. There's a big gap right there. I want it to be here, so I will put that needle down right there. That is really not that critical. So as you get more stitches in, sometimes you'll notice the threads kind of start to get a little, maybe they get twisted up just a little bit as you're doing a repeated stitch over and over and over. The needle tends to twist, and so then the threads get a little twisted up. It's helpful occasionally to let your needle and thread hang and let them untwist as that needle hangs down. That will help get them back to nice separated strands. That's a trick I use pretty often. And another thing you can do, there's such a thing as called a laying tool, which is a specific tool, but honestly, occasionally if it seems like my strands are just really twisted, the stitch is just not laying very pretty, I will come up, I will hold it with the other hand, I'll take my needle and I'll really just kind of run the needle along those strands so that they sort of line up again, and then that stitch will behave again. It's still a little bit twisted, but that's fine. Another thing I do pretty often as I'm satin stitching is I will sort of polish the threads. And I just recently learned there's actually a tool for that too, but we have a very nice built-in tool, and that's your fingernail. Honestly, sometimes I take the tip of my fingernail, or you can use the back of your nail, and really just kind of smooth it over those threads, and it just gets them to sort of all smooth down and kind of meld together and just look a little bit smoother. Now that I've gotten some stitches laid in, let's talk a little bit about tension. And I spoke earlier about the tension of your fabric, that you want it to stay very tight so that it's not loose. But there's also the tension with your stitches. And this is one of those things that the more you do it, you kind of find your right tension. Sometimes when you first start out, the tension of your stitches might be too loose or too tight, and then as you get going, everything kind of settles in. But you want to make sure that your stitches are not too tight or too loose, obviously. When you pull this thread through, you want to pull it enough so that the threads sit against the fabric. But if you pull it super tight, like keep pulling, see what's going to happen? I'm really pulling hard on it at the back. See how that fabric is puckering up and it's causing these other stitches to get out of alignment? I'm pulling them just enough. Now I kind of have to pull my fabric again in the hoop because it got sort of loosened up a little bit because I pulled so hard on it. But I want to pull that stitch just enough that it's laying against the fabric. It's also not, if I leave a loose one, I don't know if you can see that, but see how loose it is right there? I want the tension on each stitch really to be the same. Now I might have sort of messed up my stitching there because I pulled on it so hard, but you really don't want to pull those stitches too tightly. Sometimes if you're having a really bad day and you're really angry about something, might not be the best time to satin stitch, because if you are really pulling on that thread tightly and you're pulling that fabric so tight that it's puckering up, you're not going to be happy with the results. One last thing to consider when you are satin stitching inside your outline is you want to try not to leave any space between the end of your stitches and the outline itself. That's why I talk about kind of, putting the needle a little bit under that outline. So that is satin stitching with an outline. When I flipped this over to tie off a knot here at the back, I realized there was one other very important issue I wanted to talk to you about that concerns satin stitching and where to bring your needle up and put it back down into the fabric. When I am stitching, I think you noticed, I came up here and went down here. And on the back of my fabric, I ran the thread back across the back and came up here again. So I'm making this constant loop. So on the back, it looks very similar to the front. I have thread laying across the whole shape. You might be tempted to, so let's say I just went down up here, you might be tempted to come right next to it and come up right next to that stitch and go this way. So what I'm talking about is like you go down here and come up here and go down into the fabric. And then you come up the fabric here and down, up, down. So you're making little bitty stitches across the back and not leaving any thread on the back. That is very tempting to do, especially when you're using an expensive thread like silk threads. I have done it in sort of desperate moments when I am either running out of a color of thread or, but really I'm going to suggest that you not do that because several things. It's really hard to come up close to a stitch that you just went down into the fabric to come one fiber away and not in the same hole, which will just pull that stitch out that you just made. That's really hard. So you're just adding to the tediousness of your satin stitch. And I also feel like the direction of the strands, the fibers, do not lay as smoothly when you are working a stitch this direction and then another stitch goes this direction and then it comes here and then it goes here. Because I feel like instead of the fibers laying like this, they're laying like this, which again, a little thing, but really, honestly, it's just so much easier to come up here and go down here and up here and go down here constantly like that. Even though it leaves a lot of thread on the back, I really feel like it's worth it. That also brings up the point, it doesn't really matter if you start at the top and go down at the bottom and work here to here and then go back to the top and down. Again, personally, I just tend to feel like I can see better when I come up at the bottom and down at the top. But that's just the kind of thing that you'll just need to decide for yourself what is most pleasurable and most comfortable for you. To stitch a shape where you have the outline stitched on the inside and you're going to be stitching over it is very similar to this. Some of the same principles apply, obviously, except that you're just going to be coming up outside the edge of the outline. Same thing if you want to draw yourself some guidelines. Like that. And then sometimes I break my rule a little bit about making a stitch on the inside and then working over. Sometimes it's hard to start right here on this edge, like a little bitty tiny stitch. So I will come outside, come in a little bit into the shape and perhaps work across back to the edge. And then put maybe one more stitch right there, little small one. And then I'll come over and then I can start right here. So sometimes I break my own rule, not rule really, but my own sort of habits. And now, same thing, just come up on the outside of the outline and down the other side. Same thing, I still sort of polish those threads up occasionally with my fingernail. Still being careful that each stitch is next to each other and does not have a gap. When I'm satin stitching, sometimes, I kind of misjudge where to come up and I'll come up a little too far over. And can you see I have a little bit of a gap right there? Small one, a little bit, but a little bit of fabric is showing through. So yeah, I'll come back over. I'll hop over the other direction and just fill in that gap. Try not to do that too much, but that happens, that's fine. Now, I did mention that this creates a very pretty raised edge. If you want to raise up your stitching a little bit more to pad it, you can add some stitches on the inside that will give those stitches a little bit more lift. They'll kind of make them a little bit rounder. And really the easiest thing to do, I mean, you could fill the whole inside really with some stitching, but you don't really have to. Because I'm using 3 strands here, those strands add a good bit of bulk when you just make, normally I would do this before I start, but I'm just going to make what's called seed stitching. Just little random, I would fill the whole shape with just little random short straight stitches. I am going to try not to just completely cover my guidelines. But if I just evenly fill up that space with little tiny stitches like this, when I stitch over them, you'd think it wouldn't give it that much more dimension, but it really does. I am not really going to make my seed stitches go this way, the same direction as my satin stitches, because they'll just sort of blend into the satin stitching, and that's not really what you want. You really want stitches that are generally perpendicular-ish, sort of at an angle to the satin stitching you will eventually be doing. So when you have that kind of generally evenly filled, when you stitch over it, I don't know if you'll be able to tell a difference quite so much here, but it really does help to raise your stitches up a little bit more, and it looks really nice. Again, takes a little bit of time, but that really just does not take that much time to just fill up a space with seed stitching. So I've kind of found my rhythm now. I feel like I'm moving along a little bit faster. As I mentioned before, really, sometimes when you first start, it just seems like nothing's working right, but I have found over and over and over, as I continue to stitch, as I get more stitches in, and I don't mean like over the years, I mean like as I sit down to stitch and when I'm about, 5 minutes in, I just find a rhythm. And I just get faster, and my needle just seems to find right where it wants to come up and right where it wants to go down. Sometimes I'll spend a good bit really poking around in there trying to find just the right spot. And sometimes I just find it immediately. It just kind of depends on the rhythm you found with your stitching. Now, I do want to show you that last stitch. I sort of went on top of the stitch next to it. Even when it's sort of pulled tightly, it still is sort of laying on top. So let me take that one out. And you can also tell that I am slightly off on my stitching. See how my guideline goes this way? And I have all this space down here, and I don't have a lot of space up there. That's all right, no big deal. I do not have to rip it back over to here where it might be a little more accurate. I mean, that's just too tedious, even for me. So I'm just gonna, it looks fine. It's not like the angle is super critical here. I am going to try to be really close up here, and when I come down here, maybe move over just a hair or more, and then I'm going to try to sort of get myself back on. Yeah, see, two more stitches, and I am back really pretty straight up with my guidelines. So see, not that big of a deal if your angles get a little bit off. So hopefully you can see now with that edge that I've outlined, stitched underneath, and I've satin stitched over, how it gives a nice sort of almost like a beaded edge. It's very pretty, and if I went all the way across here with the seed stitching and the satin stitching, it would be nice, look like a nice puffy cloud actually. So that is how to stitch over a stitched outline. Before I start stitching the shape that has no outline, I realize there is one other thing that I do before I start stitching, but after my needle is threaded, that helps to keep those strands all laying parallel to each other. And that is, once my needle is threaded, I take these two fingers and I sort of put my thumbnail against those threads and I run the thread a couple of times like that so that my nail is sort of scraping against those threads, and it just gets them to sort of all really, again, just sit next to each other and line up instead of being perhaps maybe a little twisted. So another quick trick there. So on to this shape that has no outline. And honestly, this is probably in some ways the fastest way to do it because you don't have to spend any time putting in an outline, stitching an outline. But on the flip side, it takes a little more time to actually stitch it because you have to be really, really careful about where you bring up the needle and go down, because everywhere that thread comes out of the fabric or goes in the fabric around the edge of the shape will determine what the edge of the shape looks like. Over here, it's easier to get a nice smooth, curved or smooth, not a jagged edge on your shape because you've got that outline you've already stitched, and it's sort of giving you a kind of a barrier right there. Over here, it's just where the thread comes up and where the thread goes down. And because the edge is made up of little bitty, the end of your stitches, it does show a little bit more. But, I have stitched many, many designs that did not have any kind of outline. The more I satin stitch, the more I tend to like the way an outline looks, either on the outside or stitching over one that's on the inside. But if you want to do it this way, that is fine. Like I said, I've done many, many designs that are this way, and it's great. It's very relaxing, even though you kind of do have to take a little bit of time. So this is where I would really take the time to really be careful about where I'm bringing my needle up and where I'm going down. So let me do a couple more stitches so I can show you. All right, now see that one? It's maybe a little off. I didn't maybe come quite inside, come up right in the right place. Something that can happen is that when you come up on a stitch and when you go down and pull that thread, now we're talking like super accuracy here. When you pull on that thread, if you have come up inside your drawn line, like just even by a fiber, by the time you pull that thread, it ends up having the edge of your shape being on the inside of the line. That happened to me a little bit over here, honestly. But it really would show up here. So if I am stitching without an outline and I really want to make sure, a stitched outline, if I really want to make sure that the edge of my shape covers my line, either because it's, a permanent line, it's not going to wash out or whatever, I always come up slightly, can you see that? Slightly outside the edge of my marked line, because sometimes if I come up right on the line or even just a little bit inside the line, even by one fiber of this woven fabric, by the time that thread gets pulled across and pulled a little bit tighter, I start to get off, or the edge of that shape doesn't cover the line. Now that is like, you're going to think that's like really like one fiber, but when you multiply it times 300 stitches, it can make a difference. So like I said, I have to really just take a little bit of time. On the back of the fabric where I am bringing my needle up, I tend to kind of put a finger next to this so I can sort of guide that needle, so I'm not just poking, just like, oh, I don't know where to come up in the fabric. I have a finger that's there that kind of helps me line it up. It gives it a little bit of support. Just don't poke yourself. Trust me. We've all been there, done that, right? And occasionally, another little thing that happens is if the threads sort of get a little bit separated on the back side, where that thread comes out, I'll just sort of tug on it a little bit, or again, run my fingers down that thread so to get them to sort of, that's what I'm doing on the back. I know you can't see that. These are all little tricks to just get those strands to lay down smoothly. So now as I start this stitching around this angle, I'm going to have to change, now I'm going to come a little bit below where that thread came out. Up here, making sure I go over just a teensy bit over the drawn line, the marked line. All right, still taking my time to make sure that I really bring that needle up in exactly the right place. And I'm serious, one woven fiber of your background fabric can really make a difference about where you come up. And how your outline looks once it's all finally stitched. Let me put in a few more stitches here. All right, so there is that shape stitched with no outline. And so maybe in comparison, let me move this over. You can see here that this obviously has a more defined line because it's raised and it has that outline underneath it. And this one is perhaps not quite as, because it's not raised and because the edge is made up of little bitty points where the threads are going into the fabric or coming out of the fabric. But you know what? That's where personal preference comes in. If you just don't want to bother with an outline and just don't like the look, go for it. Like I said, I've done so many designs, so many flower petals where I just started in on my stitching and did it like this. But I really love the look of this too. It really just comes down to personal preference and what you want your finished satin stitching to look like. Let's talk a little bit more about the angle of your stitching. When we were working up here, this is a nice big open kind of a round shape, and so any angle would work really just fine. Sometimes you get shapes where they're skinnier or smaller, or they move, it's like a leaf or a stem, and sometimes the angle of your stitching can both affect how the shape looks and also how tedious it is to stitch it. So, you could stitch one of these shapes in, you could stitch it straight, perpendicular so that the lines are essentially perpendicular to the edge. In other words, it went across like, your stitching could go like this across. But honestly, that's kind of going to be choppy, and especially down here where you have this little bitty skinny, you're going to make these little teeny tiny stitches that go across. Not going to be that fun. If this is not a tiny shape, but if you have a small shape, you're not really maybe going to want to outline it either this way or that way on every shape. Like if you have a bunch of little leaves, you probably don't want to outline a little tiny shape that's a 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch big, right? So consider the angle. So if I were to try to stitch this one, let's say I wasn't going to outline it, I'm down here and I'm trying to make these little bitty teeny weeny, like microscopic stitches that are parallel to each other. It can be done, don't get me wrong. It can be done. And sometimes you do have to make little bitty tiny stitches to fill a space. But it is not that easy, especially to get the edges like really clean. You can do it, it can be done, and it can look great. I'm not saying you can't do it, but you might consider that instead of going across a shape in that direction, that you might want to consider going more at an angle. So your satin stitches could work across this shape. I would consider you could really go either way. They could go this way, to follow this angle, or they could work this way. And the benefit of that, let me see, I think I'm going to work this way. So I'm going to sort of use this line as to sort of feed off that line. I'm going to consider going that way. And what that does is that allows your stitches to be longer so that you don't have any stitches that are like just microscopic. And it also is a little more graceful when it comes to what the shape looks like when it is stitched. It's sort of the stitches, even though they're parallel to each other, they are working with the curve of the shape or the design of the shape instead of kind of fighting it. So, like I said, this is probably not a shape that I would really want to outline. You certainly could, and you could put the seed stitches on the inside. But for little tiny stitches, like I do a lot of leaves that I'm just not going to outline with little minuscule, minute back stitches every single little tiny leaf. And this is good to keep in mind for like the stem of a flower that would be really skinny. So now that I've sort of polished those, see how graceful that is as it works up the curve of the shape? And I was talking about a stem. If I had a stem of a flower and a really skinny line like that, trust me, or this works, I'm talking about lettering too. This really comes up in a lot in lettering. Like if you've got, script writing where some of it's wide and some of it's just one line, but you want to fill in the areas that are wider. You just don't, I don't want to stitch little tiny stitches that all go across here like this, because it's going to be so hard to get each of those stitches to line up perfectly so that the edge of my lettering or the width of this shape is not jagged on this side and jagged on this side, because you've had to just lay in these little teeny tiny stitches. If I was going to fill in lettering, the wide section of a lettering or a stem, I would consider working again at an angle, more like this. Which again allows you to make your stitches longer, therefore easier to make. You still have to pay attention to where the thread comes up and where it goes down. You still want to, same rules apply for the edges, but it's just easier to get those stitches to, I don't know, just be more graceful is the best way I can describe it. So even though I still have a lot of stitches coming out and going in right here, it's much easier to get these edges not look so jagged than when I'm not making teeny tiny little, 50 stitches this way instead of 25 stitches going at an angle. All right, so I hope that has helped. I know a lot of people have issues when they're trying to fill in lettering about, they want to use satin stitch, but it just looks choppy and they don't like it. This can definitely help in that situation. To wrap up, I wanted to show you several real-world examples of satin stitching and how versatile it can be. And like I think I showed you this one, but this is the one I'm working on right now. And obviously, I'm doing the seed stitch, and I did a decorative outline. Although on the interior sections here of the blue shadows at the bottom, I did not put an outline on one side, so you can combine those like that. So this one's in progress. And this one is no outline, no seed stitching, just and parallel stitches for most of this. You can see the pretty, when all those strands are all laying next to each other, it looks like silky satin, which is of course why it's called satin stitch. So there's that one. Doesn't have to be flowers or big sections. This one is, every little section is, again, parallel stitches like we've been talking about here. All going, same shape, filled in the exact same way the whole way. This one, again, is similar. All parallel, pretty much all parallel. We looked at this one. This one's a little bit chunkier, but I just decided on a different angle for every petal, but they're all parallel. All the stitches are parallel. This one is a good example of, I've been talking this whole time about stranded thread and separating your strands and how you want them to be, individual strands. But this one, and you can tell this is just one little tiny section of satin stitch, but what an impact it can have. But this is a silk thread, and it was not separated, so it stayed a little bit ropey. And even that, you can see, and it's a variegated thread, so of course it's gorgeous. But the ropey texture in this instance actually works for it, I think. It gives it a little bit of texture. Can you see that? So I hope that this has helped you perhaps either find a new love for satin stitching or maybe regain some love for a stitch that you didn't love so much, because it really is versatile and beautiful and can be a very relaxing stitch to learn. So I hope you've picked up a lot of good tips, and so now go forth and satin stitch. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.